Hello, colleagues. It's Nicolaas van Wyk speaking. I'm welcoming you to this edition of Accounting Weekly, where we podcast influencers, stakeholders, um, experts in the field related to accounting, tax, and all related matters. And today I have with me Telita Snyckers. This is the second interview we're doing with Telita. We did our first one a few weeks ago, and unfortunately we couldn't do the recording properly, and I invited Telita back for another podcast. Just a little bit about Accounting Weekly before I introduce Telita. Accounting Weekly is a publication of the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants. CIBA was started in 1987, and it's an interesting history of the accounting profession. If you would like to go to my own LinkedIn profile, I did some research about the accounting profession. Very, very interesting, and it's interesting to see that the challenges that was faced 100 years ago in the profession is still being fought out and discussed even today. So it's a lot of similarities. Um, uh, but I've been with CIBA now since 2013, and we have now grown to about 12,000 members, with members in all areas of the accounting sector. But then one thing that we do is Accounting Weekly, where we sit and try to make accounting developments, accounting news very practical for accountants and tax practitioners. And it's available on LinkedIn as well as on our website, accountingweekly.com. And then a recent addition is these podcasts that we want to do with uh, experts in the field, different aspects of tax. It is a very exciting field. I've heard that there is a problem within the profession of attracting young people to the profession. And apparently the profession isn't sexy enough. But if you listen and read Telita's articles and similar experts to her, then it's quite exciting. I'm subscribed to Safely, which does they do these or they share the court judgments on different matters, and I must say I found them very, very interesting. So if you are a student and just discovering Accounting Weekly, accounting and tax are all very exciting subjects. There's so many things to do with them, and one of the areas we're discussing today is two aspects actually, and that is the tobacco industry and then criminal investigations by tax authorities. And there's no expert better to speak with than Telita. It's especially relevant now. I think about it. Last week there's a dispute between some of the tobacco companies and SARS. Um, SARS won in a court case where they want to install cameras in the warehouses of the tobacco companies. Now, I'm not from that industry. I know very little about tobacco other than having a puff or two at an event. But when I read that in the media, I was quite intrigued. Why would SARS want to install cameras? Now, the first impression is, but it's an infringement on private property and personal space. Why would they do that? But as you read further, and as you would read, if you want to buy and obtain that book by Telita, Dirty Tobacco, Spies, Lies, and Mega Profits, it's a different world that opens up. So I want then to introduce Telita, and we'll speak a little bit about her background, what she's doing currently. She was the head of the tax practitioner unit at SARS, so she's intimately involved and knowledgeable about tax practitioners. And we'll get her back to speak about that aspect as well. But let me hand over to Telita. Telita, just share a bit about your history and background and what you are currently doing.
Super. Thanks, Nicolaas. As I said the last time we talked, it's really fun for me to get to talk to you again because, I mean, it goes back many years, but I think, relationship between tax administrations and people like yourselves is so important. And I think the work we did way back then really showed what you can achieve when you have a good working relationship across the aisle between administrations and people like yourselves. So, I see there's a comment, someone can't hear me. So let's just double check that you guys can hear me. Oh, good, Nicolaas can hear me. So we can go on, I guess. So Nicolaas, I have to correct you on one thing. You said that there might be a perception with some people that the accounting industry isn't sexy or exciting enough. Well, I tell you what, as a young law student, I thought tax law was incredibly boring. As it turns out, um, the tax industry, the accounting industry, is actually one of the single most interesting areas you can work in. And so, I think it's really good if we can have more people involved in the industry. So, a little bit about myself. I started my professional career as a prosecutor, criminal prosecutor, and then qualified as an attorney specializing in commercial litigation, where SARS was my main client. And over time, this led to me becoming the head of criminal investigations at SARS. And then I, over time, also headed up the tax practitioners at SARS. So I was actually the founding manager of the tax practitioners unit many years ago. After SARS, I started working as the head of compliance policy at the Singapore tax agency. And then for the past 10 or so years, I've been working as an independent consultant, helping tax administrations be better at what they do. And so, that one of my clients is the International Monetary Fund. But I, have some other clients too, really focusing on how we tax administrations to be better at what they do. So that's basically my background, Nicolaas.
Thank you for that introduction. It's quite an interesting background. I must say one thing that I should have done in my younger years is have a stint at SARS. I think maybe all tax practitioners should be required, like going to the army. They should spend like a year at the SARS working within the system and the processes to understand them and appreciate the challenges they face, and then start their own accounting practices. Because you do get that very interesting knowledge, and it makes you just a better tax practitioner. I'm very jealous about that development, and I'm sure all those cases that you were involved with is such a wonderful experience. So let us move then on to your publication. As I said, the tobacco industry is in the news. Every time there's a new budget being announced by the Minister of Finance, then we know there's extra taxes that they have to pay. We know from time to time there's medical reports coming out saying how bad is smoking, but we also know that they do contribute large volumes to the tax collection, and it's like a necessary thing within an economy to have that. But of late, as I said, we've seen this court case. Besides the tobacco industry, SARS seems to be gearing up their compliance drives and investigations. I think the commissioner called in last week, there was an article about professional enablers. And before that, there was the case now against SASFIN. So it does seem that SARS is targeting certain sectors and individuals and companies, and one of those is the tobacco industry. And then your book, I think, becomes very relevant again. So please, what made you decide to write the book? What does the book cover? And how do you address the issues that you've raised in your book called Dirty Tobacco? And I love this title, Spies, Lies, and Mega Profits. Telita.
Thanks, Nicolaas. I started writing the book because I came across a research study that showed how British American tobacco during the 80s made something like 40% of their profits from smuggling tobacco into China. So this is a multinational corporation that made the majority of its profits from smuggling its own products into China. And that struck me as, an interesting story. And so I started digging a bit more into why, tobacco smuggling is such a popular activity, and in particular, why multinational companies would get involved in it. So something that's important to remember is that the profits on black market tobacco or on smuggled tobacco means that it's more profitable than smuggling heroin. It's more profitable than smuggling, arms and ammunition. You make more profit on a container of uh, smuggled tobacco than you would, be a drug dealer. And the risks are relatively low. And it's actually a very simple business model. So remember, you pay taxes and duties on all of the cigarettes you manufacture that are consumed locally. And so, very simply, the game is to underdeclare the volume of cigarettes that are sold on the local market. So, you can do this in a number of different ways. You can run, two production lines, and maybe SARS only knows about one of the two production lines. It's easy to manipulate the volumes that come off the production lines. So you only declare a certain part of the volume to the tax administration. The other way that you can cheat the system is very simply to pretend that you exported the cigarettes, because once they leave, the country, there isn't any duty payable on the cigarettes. So that's very broadly speaking how the tobacco companies underpay their duties and their taxes. And this is something that we see not just, with some of the smaller, maybe low cost manufacturers, for instance, in South Africa, but it's actually something we see the bigger multinational tobacco companies also do as a way of under declaring the volumes and therefore underpaying their taxes. So, this in the simplest terms is how you make the tobacco industry profitable. Of course, when you look at the multinational companies, you also start looking at issues around transfer pricing, maybe more sophisticated tax evasion and tax evasion schemes. But in the main, what we're looking at is companies under-declaring their volumes. And that's why, for instance, the recent case with putting cameras up in production facilities is so important and such an interesting development. For the longest time, SARS has been saying that it isn't able to necessarily always validate and verify the volumes of cigarettes that have been manufactured. Because, for instance, in many countries, cigarette packs are actually marked so that you can count the actual accurate volume that has been. SARS doesn't have a mechanism like that. And so introducing something like cameras, remember the cameras are mostly pointed at the manufacturing equipment. So you can actually see and validate what volumes of cigarettes are coming off of the production. And again, this is something that would be for both the local low-cost manufacturers, but also for the, kind of multinational corporations. I think part of the challenge is when we think about criminal activity, when we think about, what a smuggler looks like, we have a certain image in our mind. And we don't necessarily realize that multinational corporations are just as guilty in this particular sphere as, the local low-cost manufacturers are. So, that very briefly is how they would cheat it and why I think the introduction of video cameras is so important.
Yeah, it's scary listening to what you're saying, and I agree with you. I watched that series on Netflix, Ozark, where they used the gambling facilities to launder the mafia's money. But you never think about a listed company that do integrated reports and publish sustainability reports and messages about how they support society and the good they're doing, actually doing hardcore tax evasion by manipulating production processes. And what is really scary and hard to imagine, just like in Ozark, I suppose they build these parallel systems, because that's what you're saying. There's a system that with of expenses and revenue that they declare, and then there's a parallel invoicing system. Because I'm always amazed looking at these mafia movies that the mafia also need accountants and tax practitioners because they have to count and run their businesses efficiently. So that means it's not only the directors involved, but the production managers and eventually the finance team. And if you calculate those numbers, it's large numbers of people involved. I think I saw this with, I first became aware of this with the VBS bank scandal when about 450 of the employees were indicted. Of course, that was 450 people that was actively involved in defrauding municipalities and running a fake bank. Just last night, I read about the Fort Hare scandal, where the internal staff members colluded with suppliers, and actually they were running. Well, it was all allegations still, but they were running uh, they appointed a forensic firm and an attorney firm to clean up the uh, fraud and stuff that they discovered there. And it's actually they alleged now that uh, all that they did was then to continue those processes. So yeah, it's very real because I suppose that's organized crime. Um, has there ever been then in South Africa, besides just looking at the tax issues, criminal prosecutions against some of the directors of the tobacco companies?
Well, that's where it becomes quite interesting. So, um, one of the things where there's ample evidence for is that particularly the larger multinational tobacco companies have a way of insinuating themselves into the enforcement and investigation process. So something we saw it in South Africa, we've seen it in Nigeria, we've seen it in Botswana, we've seen it in Australia, many countries where the big multinational companies um, offer their help to the tax administration. Um, so they play on the fact that tax administrations have limited capacity, limited resources, and so the big multinationals will say, we can help you with intelligence. We can help you with analysis of data. We can help you to choose who to investigate. We can help you to choose who to prosecute. We can help you write your legislation. We can help you write your policies. So this is what we see in many countries where the multinational companies end up literally sitting around the table with representatives from the intelligence industry or from the tax administration and literally choose who to investigate and prosecute because they play this game where they position themselves as the good guys. We're a multinational corporation. Well, of course, we're the good guys and we want to help the country do the right thing. And what that means is that, on balance of probability, the director of a smaller, local, low-cost tobacco company is far more likely to face investigation and prosecution simply because, in many instances, they were selected for investigation by their opposition. We have to remember, looking back at the South African market, historically, a company like British American Tobacco would have, held by far the majority of the market. That's no longer the case. They are facing competition from these small competitors, and it is absolutely in their interest to get rid of their smaller competitors. And one of the ways in which they do that is by helping law enforcement choose their competitors as targets for investigations and prosecutions. We see in other countries where the directors of multinational corporations have in fact been prosecuted, have in fact faced substantial fines. So even the multinational corporations do get taken to task. Now, we know at some point in South Africa, evidence suggests that SARS was ready to lay criminal charges against the corporations and previously against some within the multinational corporations. We know, well, evidence suggests that SARS may have been ready to lay criminal charges against them. Evidence also suggests that those criminal charges then disappeared in a puff of smoke, with everything that happened around Tom Mayani's appointment. So typically, I guess then, on balance of probability, the smaller guys are more likely to be selected for investigation and prosecution, in large part because the multinationals help to select them as targets, but also in part because I think for a tax administration, there's this question about actually taking on large multinational corporations. If you look at how much of our pension money is invested in a company like British American Tobacco, uh, what would happen if SARS, for instance, were to lay criminal charges against a company like British American Tobacco? We saw something similar happening in the UK, where their organised crime agency was investigating British American Tobacco for their activities in South Africa. And those charges were dropped. And again, there is some evidence to suggest that those charges were dropped not because there wasn't enough evidence against British American Tobacco, but simply because the fallout from a prosecution like that might not have been politically palatable. And so, therefore, the decision was made that maybe it was economically best not to pursue investigations or prosecutions against a company like British American Tobacco.
That is so interesting. We'll definitely have you back. You're sharing and opening up the veil about things that the normal general tax practitioner have never heard of. So thank you for sharing that. I remember reading a few months ago about one of the big four firms in Australia assisting the tax authority with drafting legislation because of the expertise that they have and the lack of expertise that the tax authority has. But then it transpired that they were then writing the legislation, but then going back to the office, sharing it with the other units within the Big Four, and then they were developing schemes and plans for their clients and selling those in anticipation of the legislation that they were drafting. So it's, I suppose it's funny in a way because it's so scary that I think the word is regulatory capture. I have dealt with many government officials when we do submissions to Parliament and engage with them to obviously help shape the legislation. But it's always important, and some public officials do it better than others in keeping this independent position and stance. Being skeptical, I suppose, about the information being provided by the private sector. Um, so that you can give a fair chance to everybody to be heard. But I don't know whether our public officials get the right training in how to manage this process um, to be able to differentiate what is good advice. And it's always the bigger guys because they have bigger resources that can actually influence and support. And I'm also now reminded now that based on what you said, I've been thinking about the national health insurance and all the big medical aid companies suggesting similar things of being able to assist. But there is a thing to do to protect society against big corporates because of the powerful positions that they have. But thank you for sharing that information about the intricate world of public prosecution and public investigations and having to balance that with economic concerns. Because those are very real. No? You can't have your pension funds collapse because you're pursuing a matter with a big multinational. But that brings us to the second part of our conversation, and that is the criminal investigations by tax authorities. And I suppose it's important for everybody to understand as tax practitioners that we all work within an economic system, and that system has gears and checks and balances in it. Tax practitioners being advisors and assisting taxpayers with meeting their tax obligations, the tax authorities having to collect what Parliament sets as the budget for the country. And then there's a part to this that relates to enforcement. Now, the SARS is a very powerful organization, especially when they do their verifications and their audits on smaller taxpayers that don't have the funding. I'm just busy with my own filings and verifications now with SARS, and it's keeping me busy. I have to prove everything, which I think is a bit of an overreach because it takes so much time out of my work life, and I've wrote my wife in, so it can be very cumbersome. But on the other hand, like you mentioned, there's these big corporates and it's a necessary element of a tax authority doing criminal investigations. And one of your recent posts, I have it open here on my phone, and I can recommend to our audience to visit your LinkedIn profile. This is a wealth of information. It's really helpful. But a recent post was entitled Top 10 Reasons Why Criminal Investigations at Tax Administrations Fail. Would you like to just elaborate on those and why it's necessary to get this right?
Well, a tax administration has a number of tools at its disposal. The primary purpose, I guess, of a tax administration is to make sure that taxpayers comply with their obligations and that the tax administration collects the taxes that are due, right? And to do so, you have a number of tools at your disposal. I think something that SARS was incredibly good at, and where SARS was actually ahead of the curve internationally, was this idea that there are many ways of getting taxpayers to do the right thing. So, a large part of that lies in making sure that taxpayers understand what their obligations are, that taxpayers know how to do the right thing, that it's easy to do the right thing. So, a lot of that lies in, how do we design the user experience? How do we craft our policies? How do we engage with taxpayers? How do we engage? How do we communicate? How do we educate? And so increasingly, you find that tax administrations are investing very heavily in that space where it's proactive, preventive, positive encouragement to comply with your obligations. And this is something that SARS has been doing for many years now, and that we see modern tax administrations doing. So that balance between service on the one hand and enforcement on the other hand is critical to getting taxpayers to do the right thing. As part of the conversation around maybe more enforced compliance or around enforcement activities themselves, it's important to understand that these are very costly and resource intensive activities. So, a tax administration typically would want to save their criminal investigations for those cases where it can have the biggest possible impact, for those cases where there's real criminality and where, we can actually either recover a significant amount of revenue at stake or where we can make the point that criminal activities targeting the tax system won't be tolerated. So, as I said, I started my professional life as a prosecutor, and then I started the special compliance unit at SARS, which focused on people like Dave King. We did Ivan Corza, who's the guy who brought the World Cup, FIFA World Cup to South Africa. So we looked at the biggest Mandrax dealer in South Africa. We looked at the Chinese triads. And then, from that, I headed up criminal investigations in South Africa. And I was lucky that I was there at the point where we were transitioning from an old, archaic, system to something that reflects the kind of good practices that you would want to see in a tax administration. And then, like I said, the last 10 years I've been working as a consultant. So I've had access to, I think, tax administrations in maybe 25 countries. So the good news, at least, is that in principle and in theory, criminal investigations at SARS are actually quite advanced in terms of many of the good practices that one would expect to see. But when we look at, investigations generically and generally, there are some areas where they see that they don't work the way they should be. The first reason why criminal investigations often aren't as effective as they should be is because they operate outside of a broader compliance risk management strategy. So very often we find that criminal investigators work in a black box, kind of on the fringes of the tax administration. and they're not used as part of a broader phased strategy to influence taxpayer behavior. So I think the first critical dimension, if we want our criminal investigations to function properly, is there has to be an explicit strategy that says, how does this fit into our broader approach in terms of encouraging taxpayers to do the right thing? And then, related to that is having an actual criminal investigation strategy where we're very explicit about the outcomes that we want to achieve. Is the intended outcome securing revenue, or does it go far beyond that? So, for criminal investigations, we need to know, how do we actually measure success? And then part of that strategy, how do we leverage engagement? How do we leverage partnerships? Now, Nicolaas, you and I have started talking about maybe having more conversations precisely about this idea of leverage and partnerships between an organization like SARS and people like yourselves. So a large part of a proper criminal investigation strategy should look at how can we leverage relationships and engagement. Then, the third reason I think why criminal investigations often fail is where a country has weak case selection and allocation. Uh, so, way back when I first joined SARS, for instance, criminal investigators were allowed to choose their own cases. So a criminal investigator back then would actually decide who to investigate and what for. And over time, what happened is there was a much more structured, much more robust case selection and allocation system where, you know, risk profiling, risk rules for case selection. And then related to that, is how do we take information from whistleblowers and from informants in a structured, systematic way? So, for instance, by introducing a suspicious activity reporting framework. So, part of that then also is that we need to have a transparent, explicit prioritization framework. So, if there are 100 possible cases we could be investigating, and we only have capacity and resources to investigate 5, how do we choose which of those cases we want to focus our criminal investigations on? Then, again, something that we saw when I first joined SARS was that we had very unstructured work processes. There was way too much discretion. Um, so over time, we changed that to introduce very structured, phased investigative steps. We introduced structured policies on the handling of informants and whistleblowers. Policies on how do you obtain evidence, how do you secure evidence, how do you keep an investigative diary. But that kind of structured work process is incredibly important if you want to be successful in terms of a criminal investigation. I think the fifth reason, which is something that countries often have trouble with, is where criminal investigators don't manage their relationship with prosecutors. So very often, you'll see in countries where they say, well, we have no control over the outcome of prosecutions. Well, actually, you do. Um, you can engage with prosecutors. You can help prosecutors understand, the ways in which evasion actually takes place, for instance. You can speak to prosecutors about what capacity they actually have. We see in many countries where they simply refer hundreds of thousands of cases to the prosecutors, who themselves have a limited capacity. So, this idea of managing the relationship with prosecutors is incredibly important in terms of managing effective criminal investigations. The sixth reason, which I think is really important for people like yourselves, um, is the fact that very often in tax administration, our staff lack technical skills, and notably when it comes to forensic auditing, financial analysis, or industry insights. Um, Nicolaas, and this touches on something that you mentioned earlier, that it's so important to get the right skills in a tax administration. And it would be fantastic if more of our auditors, accountants, forensic experts, people like yourselves, actually spend time working at a tax administration, because those skills are so critical to ensuring that we have the kind of outcomes that we need to. I think very often we attach a very negative connotation to paying tax and to tax administrations. Um, Tax is the price we pay for our democracy. And truth be told, like I said at the beginning, this is some of the most exciting work you can hope to do. Um, I think working in this kind of enforcement and compliance field at a tax administration exposes you to the most interesting work you could possibly hope to do. I've had breakfast with the head of the Chinese triads in South Africa. Um, and yeah, so the one thing I would do from this conversation maybe is to encourage more of your members, people listening, to actually consider working at the tax administration. It's incredibly exciting, but at the same time, it also needs your technical skills. It needs your insights in terms of particular industries for it to be effective. I think, another aspect where we often see issues relates to how we manage information. So many tax administrations fail because they don't actually track their activities. They don't track the outcomes and the impact that their investigations are having. They don't analyze the data that is available for business process improvement. I think, again, that is something that SARS has been incredibly good at. Their management reports traditionally have been incredibly detailed, incredibly well structured. Um, they provide you with insights and analysis that I think is hard to beat. But having said that, again, very often we see that criminal investigations operate in some kind of black box outside of the traditional activity. So it's really important, if we want our investigations to have a real effect, that we should also make sure that our management information systems actually track the impact that we are actually having. Then, there's an interesting example in terms of why tax administrations often don't have a lot of positive outcomes with their criminal investigations. So, for instance, a country I've been doing some work in recently have some legislative rules that prevent an investigator from testifying during a prosecution. So they gather the evidence and then they're not allowed to testify in court. So there are some examples, countries that have very weak legislative powers. This, I think, is not really an issue in SARS as much as it is in some of the other countries we've seen. Then another one, which I think again is something where we could use skill sets from people like yourselves, relates to how we analyze the return on investment from investigations. Typically, criminal investigations are dramatically underfunded and under-resourced. And I think a large part of that is because they haven't necessarily learned how to analyze and how to do a business case for the return on investment you get from criminal investigations. And then, the last one, which again I think is part of a broader conversation in terms of why tax administrations aren't as effective as they could be, is that the outcomes that the agency achieves aren't used to shape taxpayer perceptions regarding the likelihood of fraud being detected, and then the impact of consequences if someone is convicted. So, those, broadly speaking, I think are the 10 reasons why criminal investigations sometimes aren't as effective as they could be. Again, I think looking back 20 years ago at SARS, many, if not all of these, were certainly present. But I think we can take some courage from the fact that at least the majority of these issues, in the context of SARS, aren't really significant challenges anymore today.
Thank you very much for that concise list. It's interesting to appreciate and listen to a different perspective. As tax practitioners, we kind of on the client side and we try and gather all the relevant information, struggle to get the client to submit stuff to us, make sense of the financials, submit it to SARS, get the verification, submit the supporting documents, and then there's delays, and the process carries on, and there's issues with VAT refunds and stuff. So that's what we busy working with. But within SARS, there's this whole unit of criminal investigations looking at large corporates, like you said, meeting with the Chinese, the triad that you mentioned. That must have been an interesting conversation. And yeah, with high skilled level people doing these investigations. So and also quite necessary. I think the balance, I suppose, is how do you? There's this saying, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I'm sure sometimes tax practitioners feel that they're getting the hard end of the stick from SARS. But I'm sure it's very difficult for a tax official when you see these tobacco companies and large multinationals aggressively trying to avoid and evade taxes. Then you would maybe look at all taxpayers and tax practitioners in the same way. How would you address that? I don't know whether it's a real perspective. Um, how would you manage that if you were still back in the tax practitioner unit?
Well, you know, I think your observation is absolutely accurate. This idea, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a knife. I think that's part of the problem. So um, when I engage with countries, when we first start talking about compliance risk management, one of the conversations I always start off by having is by saying, my mom is a pensioner. She's a retired school teacher. She genuinely wants to make sure that she does the right thing when she completes her tax return. She has, she doesn't have a particularly complex or sophisticated kind of, she doesn't have complex or sophisticated financial affairs. So her tax matters are relatively straightforward. She wants to do the right thing. Um, then, maybe by contrast, my dentist needs to complete his VAT returns. Um, he is not a tax expert. He'd kind of like to do the right thing, but honestly, he'll just do whatever is easiest. So if there's a way to cheat the system, it's not because he needs to be a criminal. He just, wants to find the easiest possible way of getting rid of his tax affairs. And then you have, the biggest drug dealer in South Africa who has, captured the mandrax market. And then you have maybe multinational corporations. And I think fundamentally, when we design strategies, when we engage, when we communicate, when we decide who to focus on, that distinction in its simplest form is really critical to underpinning how we engage with different groups. So the first thing is, not everyone is created equal. Not everyone needs the same kind of assistance or support. And not everyone needs the same kind of risk-based treatment. So I think that's maybe the first one to start with. The second one is, historically, SARS has really invested quite heavily in risk systems, risk rules. So what that does is it looks at trends and patterns, looks at outlines, and it should be able to tell you where the biggest potential risk lies. And then that's where you want to focus your compliance efforts, right? So we need a significant amount of investment in terms of our risk rules. So I'll give you an example. Way back when I started the tax practitioners unit, one of the ideas I was trying to sell to the organization was that we should do some kind of risk profiling almost of tax practitioners, of tax intermediaries, because just as different taxpayers pose different risks, different tax practitioners and intermediaries pose different risks. And it's actually relatively easy to begin to assign risk scores to different tax practitioners. Where you have someone who has internal control mechanisms, someone who is clearly trying to engage with the tax system in a positive or constructive manner, that person should be treated differently to someone who disengages, who um, who is clearly intent on selling tax evasion avoidance schemes to their clients. And there are ways in which you could build, risk systems like that. I think a large part of it also lies in building these risk rules with input from people like yourselves. When you look at your clients, I think whether a taxpayer um, is intentionally trying to cheat the system, whether they're genuinely trying to do the right thing. So I think that's an important part of the conversation as well.
Mm. Now that's words of wisdom, and thank you for sharing that with us. It does also relate to what's in the news now lately of SARS doing the AI to assist it with the identifying risks and doing all those things. But I'm always scared about the average of statistics being lumped into an average type of um, taxpayer, and then having the group. So having that personal individual intelligence and wisdom, I suppose, with tax officials, I think is also a very important element. But Telita, we will definitely invite you for a follow-up discussion, your third follow-up. I'm really looking forward to your insights on tax practitioners. We've been doing a few articles in Accounting Weekly for the listeners to go and read about the critical role they play and how to improve their relationship between SARS and themselves to make the tax filing process easier for everybody. But Telita, again, a big thank you for joining us on Accounting Weekly. It's always nice to speak with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the opportunity, again, to talk to you. Like I said, it's really fun talking to people that, we historically worked with and that we have a good relationship with. Um, I think ultimately, I just want to very briefly touch on something
Mm,
you said now, Nicolaas, about the use of AI and about the use maybe of risk rules
mm,
to identify specific groups. It's really important that, whether we use risk rule systems or whether we use AI, the fact that a taxpayer is assigned to a particular group does not mean that that taxpayer is necessarily non-compliant. It does not mean that that taxpayer is necessarily out to cheat the system, or that they should be, receive an assessment, or in the case of customs, a customs schedule. So, for instance, typically, most tax administrations would score taxpayers on a basis of kind of, A, B, C, or D risk taxpayer. So it's really important, I think, for the tax administration itself, but also for people like yourselves, to very fully engage with this fact, that the fact that a taxpayer is classified in a particular risk sector or segment, or with a particular risk score, never means that that taxpayer is necessarily non-compliant. So, for instance, one of the countries I've done some work with, um, they, would have taxpayers maybe fall into a high risk category, and they would simply send them a tax assessment. That's obviously not what this is meant to do. It's simply meant to help you figure out, if we can only do 10 audits, who are the taxpayers we should probably audit. Um, and then balanced with that, what you'll also see is that it's regarded as a good practice to actually have some random audits as well. So, in other words, we do audits where the taxpayers weren't selected based on risk rules or through AI, for instance, because it's a way of validating whether your risk rules are actually, adept at identifying the high risk people. So I think that's a fascinating conversation in terms of, how do we use risk rules? What does it mean if a taxpayer has a risk score, that shows they're a high risk or a low risk? So that's another interesting conversation we could
mm.
have.
Sure. I think it was Alice in Wonderland. Her father said she must think up a new thought before breakfast or 5. Now, you've shared with me about 10 new things I didn't know. So I found the conversation very useful, and I'm now a better person for that. So thank you very much, Telita, for sharing it with me and Accounting Weekly, and looking forward to our next interaction.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicolaas. Good day to you and to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
What do our defining moments look like? Just like this moment right now. They look like pride after achieving that long sought-after goal. All the small victories along the way that didn't feel momentous until we saw them in the rearview mirror. They look like the courage it takes to take that first big step. All the times we fail and rise again. And without even knowing it, cultivating an inner strength that is contagious along the way. They look like the inspiration that comes from knowing that we are not alone. They look like the human relationships that give us wisdom beyond what data ever could. They look like the curiosity that comes from exploring, that allow us to create and contribute. They look like education that unlocks our full potential, using our knowledge for impact. They look like choosing our own definition of success, over hiding, over hustling, over pretending. They look like others showing up and recognizing our efforts after all the times we already showed up for ourselves. They look like being bold enough to be extraordinary. They look like you. Right now, right here. First, we help you see your defining moments. Then we help you seize them. We are the accounting body for everyone. We are the accounting body